Hola chicos, bienvenidos. Mi nombre es Hawani. So you want to learn Spanish in 2026? Well, of course, why wouldn't you? After all, it's spoken in many different countries, and as a native English speaker, it's a lot easier to learn compared to other languages. However, in my humble opinion, there are a few things that you need to be aware of or that you need to consider before you start in order to give yourself the best chance of success, instead of giving up after only a few short months, which is what happens most of the time with most people, at least in my experience. Now, with that being said, I've broken it down into 5 simple steps of things you need to consider before you start, and then other things to consider along the way. Now, without any further ado, let's jump straight into it. El número uno. Now, before you start learning Spanish, the question you need to ask yourself is, why exactly do you want to learn the language? But more importantly, have you also considered the opportunity cost to learning Spanish? Now, when I say opportunity cost to learning Spanish, what do I mean exactly? Let me give you an example personally. As most of you know, I currently live in Australia, and over the last 7 years, I've dedicated a huge amount of time, countless hours during that period, learning Spanish instead of doing a lot of other things I could have been doing with my time instead. Not only that, financially speaking, I currently spend between $150 to $200 per week on private one-on-one lessons with my Spanish teachers. Now, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is, over that 7-year period, I've dedicated so much time to learning the language instead of doing other things I could have been doing. And also financially speaking, I've probably spent between $25,000 to $30,000 over the last 7 years to learning the language, but that's not even including the immersion trips that I've been on as well, where I've gone to Spain multiple times, and earlier this year I also went to Argentina, which was strictly for learning the language. So if you've considered both the positives and the negatives to learning Spanish and you still want to progress forward, then great, that's the first step. The second step, I believe, is the foundation to learning the language, which is getting familiar with the pronunciation. So to start with, I think the first step is to get comfortable with the vowels in Spanish, because this really sets yourself up to communicate more efficiently. I can't tell you how many times during my first few months of learning the language where I tried to attempt saying something to a native speaker, however they had no clue what I was trying to say, basically because my pronunciation was so bad, which is inevitable, of course. These things are going to happen and it's all part of the process. However, if you can get really comfortable with the pronunciation early, then it just makes things a lot easier down the line. So with that being said, let's practice the vowels in Spanish. So we're going to go through them. I'll pronounce them a few times and then I'll get you to say it out loud as well. So we've got A, E, I, O, and U. So A, E, I, O, U. So this time I'll say it and then you say it afterwards. A, E, I, O, U. Now, don't worry if it doesn't come to you straight away. Remember, these things do take time to set in. However, once you start to become more comfortable with the pronunciation, step number 3 is to start practicing some useful words and phrases that you can use in a conversation with a native speaker. So most of you will already be familiar with words like hola, hola, remembering the H in Spanish is always silent, or ¿cómo estás? So, ¿cómo estás? So outside of those 2 words, here are my 8 most useful Spanish phrases for beginners. First up, ¿cómo te llamas? ¿Cómo te llamas? Which is, what is your name? We've also got me llamo, which is, my name is, me llamo Hawani, for example. Hablas español? Hablas español? Do you speak Spanish? Or you could say, hablas inglés? Hablas inglés? Do you speak English? ¿Cómo se dice? ¿Cómo se dice? Which means, how do you say? For example, ¿cómo se dice table en español? ¿Cómo se dice table en español. How do you say table in Spanish? ¿Qué significa eso? ¿Qué significa eso? What does that mean? ¿Puedes repetirlo, por favor? ¿Puedes repetirlo, por favor? Can you repeat it, please? No entiendo. No entiendo. I don't understand. Estoy bien. Estoy bien. I am good. So if someone asks you, ¿Cómo estás? You can say, Estoy bien. I am good. Or Estoy triste. I am sad. Now, after you've started to become more comfortable in the language, you've learnt a few more of these basic phrases, you've had a few conversations in the language, you might have taken a few classes, watched more videos, the next step, or step number 4, is to start using compound phrases as soon as you can. Now, with that being said, what are compound phrases and why are they so powerful? The reason they're so powerful is because once you start to learn verb conjugation in Spanish, the reason why compound phrases are so good and so useful is because it means we don't have to conjugate the second or even third verbs that we're using in Spanish, making it a lot easier. To give you an example, the best free verbs that I found personally to start practicing compound phrases with were the verbs querer, to want, poder, to be able to or can, and tener, to have. So let's use querer for example. If I conjugate it in the present tense to say I want, I could say quiero mejorar mi español. Quiero mejorar mi español. I want to improve my Spanish. So you'll notice there how I'm only conjugating the verb querer in the present tense. However, the second verb mejorar is in its unchanged infinitive form. So that is a compound phrase. Let me give you another example. Quiero entrenar esta noche. Quiero entrenar esta noche. I want to train tonight. Again, you'll notice the second verb entrenar, to train, is in its unchanged infinitive form. Now, moving on to step number 5, which is of course after many more months after step number 4, when you're starting to become comfortable with compound phrases, your vocabulary is starting to come along, and you can actually carry a bit of a conversation at this stage. The next step, or step number 5, is to start learning expressions or phrases that are very useful and commonly used in the language. So there's obviously numerous ones that you can use. I'll just give you one example though, which is acabar de plus another verb in its infinitive form, which is an expression that basically expresses what you've just done in the recent past. So it's exactly the same as how we'd use it in English. Let me give you a few examples. Acabo de ir a la playa. Acabo de ir a la playa. I just went to the beach. Again, you notice how I just conjugate the verb acabar, then I can leave the verb ir, to go, in its unchanged infinitive form. So it's a very useful one to use, and there's many more phrases that are similar out there. Let me give you another example. Acabo de entrenar con Juan. Acabo de entrenar con Juan. I just trained with Juan. Nice work, everyone. So after considering all of that, I do hope that you make the decision to join us along that Spanish learning journey throughout 2026. As always, if I can help with anything else, please don't hesitate to leave a comment or a question in the comment section below. And I look forward to seeing you again in the next video. Hasta pronto.